to the fifth Truth and Reconciliation Work Week from the Inside Out. This is something we do every year around the full moon of July. And why? Because it's called Guru Purnima, which is the full moon to that principle of the enlightened self that's inside each of us, the Guru principle, right? The higher self, the wisdom self inside each of us. And you and I share our teachers. We are both Aurobindonians. Sri Aurobindo and the mother have informed our worldviews very greatly. So I'm Nilima Bhatt. I am the founder of Shakti Leadership and a convener of this Truth and Reconciliation movement, which is a global self-organizing movement. And Dr. Irena Ataljevic is a PhD in human geography. And she's the foundress of Terra Mira, a center for regeneration in Croatia. And she's also someone who convenes the Regenerate Europe conference that I have been at for the last 2 years. I was invited to be a speaker, and I met the most amazing community of people she's gathered around this idea. And the reason, Irena, I invite you to today's dialogue on this very special full moon of the Guru Purnima is to shine the light on your body of work and the wisdom of your body of work. In particular, that speaks to the theme of this year's Truth and Reconciliation Week, which is healing our histories and decolonizing ourselves. Now, we know the concept of decolonization is something that is gaining traction everywhere, and all domains of life seem to need decolonizing. Anywhere I look, people are using the word.
Yes,
so I want you to focus today on, of course, your work, which is decolonizing regeneration and tourism and so on. But before that, can we start with your more academic understanding of the word decolonization? I think that's important because it's almost an academic term, and we need to use it in a more intentional way and in a way that is cleanly defined and understood by all. So can you just start with telling us what is decolonization?
Thank you, Nilima. Thank you for, first of all, to your invitation to be part of these global dialogues that are so important for our world on, truth and reconciliation. And I'm so happy to share this space with a few others who have joined us today. Greetings from a beautiful island of Murter, where I originally come from in Croatia. So greetings to everyone. I thank you for this really critical question, as I just introduce the location from which I speak, which I left in early 1990s. And I think Stefan, being originally from Belgrade, maybe he's much younger than will remember these difficult times of Croatia of the time of civil war in former Yugoslavia. And at that time, I really didn't have a broader understanding of the global political economy. I was a beautiful Tito's child of our ideology of Yugoslavia and all that. And then when the war happened, everyone tried to convince us that this is all about us uncivilized people who are fighting against each other, until I moved to New Zealand and started my PhD from a very critical neo-Marxist geography perspective, which then, when I started to be faced with the concept of colonization, neo-colonization, only a few years later to understand the true process of decolonization also. And that was when I, for the first time, learned that our world as we experience it today in terms of the modern capitalism and neoliberal capitalism is the heritage of basically of course, we don't go back into the history of all our civilizations and Roman civilization that informed our modern civilization and enlightenment and all this kind of European, Eurocentric formation of the world and our cultures. This is how the colonization started, of course, with Europeans traveling on the big ships and starting physically. First, it started with the Christian missionaries and then continued to be kind of colonizing the rest of the world with a very strong European influence of Christianity and the cultures, which then continued until today. By at that time, the colonization was happened directly. We know that the major colonizing force was the UK, United Kingdom, that colonized India and many other, other countries, then Spain colonizing the South America and so on. And that was very obvious political and very forceful violating process that was doing it. But then in 20th century, the colonization started to happen much more subtly. So especially when so-called third world countries, which I always found it so fascinating how people take it so lightly, that, okay, it's a third world countries, and we don't ask ourselves where this term is actually coming from, and that has been always the countries that after the Second World War, as the world was divided basically in three blocks, it was the NATO-based Western capitalist world. There was the first world, the most advanced countries. Then was the second world of the Soviet Union bloc and Eastern Europe. And then the third world was everyone else, which did not fit into their category. And we were kind of called non-aligned alliance. So, and then the true process of colonization starts to happen. By actually very subtle processes of colonizing our minds. Already they colonized our mind by coming into the territories of South America, which is anyhow the term that is also the terminology in itself, and the way how we structure the world is Eurocentric. So then they continued that, but much more subtly, because obviously with the growing awareness of consciousness, collective consciousness, that we can't just go into someone else's territory and colonize them and claim it is the UK or part of the great empire. The colonization continues to happen through discourses, representation, and the policies and creation of the global mind, and the promise of the 20th century, which was the promise of the modernity and the progress and all that. So much better way to introduce your colonizing power in a soft way, in a way that you do it and people don't feel, okay, now I am violated by this intruder who is coming onto my land, but you actually co-opt people into co-creation of this kind of system. And I remember when I was in fully in academic world, before I kind of stepped down and decided to be more critical practitioner on the ground, and now sort of with a lot of pride saying potentially regenerative practitioner. I was learning so much from so-called subaltern literature, where actually it was created in the region where you currently sit in Mexico, Argentina, which we call the Global South perspective. And I remember quoting, reading one very powerful quote that summarizes this 500 years of colonization. And it was by Henrik Dassel, a very, very well-known theorist of transmodernity, which is another area which I wrote a lot about in terms of the paradigm shift from modernity to postmodernity, when we started to criticize the modern colonizing force of this unifying, so-called unifying homogeneous thesis of the global world. But that transmodernity is another subject, and we might touch it if we get a chance to talk about it. But Dassel said it very nicely, how to summarize 500 years of colonization. He said, first it started, and referring especially, of course, to the countries of so-called third world. So if you do not Christianize, we kill you. If you do not civilize, we kill you. If you do not develop, we kill you. If you do not liberalize, we kill you. If you do not democratize, we kill you. So the discourse changes. It was from the Christian missionaries which has a lot to do also with the travel. You will see when we start to talk about how travel is tourism is a powerful colonizing force. So it started with missionaries, and then powerful cultural figures like Mark Twain, who comes to New Zealand and promotes New Zealand as an exotic destination and whatever, while actually at the same time opens up for very powerful economic forces to come in and to colonize the land. And at the end of the day, always to take away resources from the local people. So, colonization has had many different forms. It started with a very obvious, strong material political processes, such as first slavery and taking away people from Africa to be slaves in America, to take away the people's land, or gold as they were taking from India to take it to UK. Then it was becoming more and more subtle, because of course we had the freedom fighters who wanted to stop this violence over people, over land, and we finally managed to fight for independence. But the colonization has not stopped. And now we have an illusion that we have a freedom and that we live in a decolonized world. But now colonization of our minds and of our behavior and of the way how we are in the world is very much colonized by much more subtle processes of identity politics and discourses and representation, which is very well documented and elaborated by French philosophers like Deleuze and others who have been at the forefront of this so-called representational turn in 1990s, when I started my PhD in New Zealand, studying all this shift from modernity to postmodernity. So it's a very high theoretical start, but I think it has been very important to state it as such.
I love it. I love it. I'm reminded again how brilliant you are, Irena, and how much I appreciate that brilliance. You have not just the heart of an activist and a seeker, but you have a tremendous scholarly mind that really complements all the work you do and gives it the gravitas it needs, no? So to continue more on that, how do you see decolonization happening at this time? What are the ways to go about decolonizing? First of all, are people ready? What are the kind of resistances that are coming up? Maybe we go there next, and then the follow-on question will be specific to tourism then.
Yeah, and I think that's very important, because I never studied tourism really as the industry or the phenomenon per se. I did my PhD in human geography at the time in 1990s in New Zealand, when actually I was studying the local processes and the community regional development from this critical perspective. And then tourism just came into the picture as one of those very powerful neo-colonial forces. So to talk about tourism as a form of neo-colonial force, we cannot do it without addressing these kind of issues. So that's a kind of flow we really need to follow in order for our audience to really appreciate what we are trying to say. So now, as we established that we actually live in first we began 500 years ago with a very strong actually a very violating form of colonization, and then into neo-colonization, which was more subtle. Then we kind of which I think very much follows our Aurobidian perspective of the natural evolution of human consciousness, as you get more and more individuals waking up to the reality that we don't take anything for granted, that this whole normalized discourse is actually not normal. I love to quote here Dr. Vandana Shiva. We know our huge fighter against the corporate oligarchy that is poisoning our, as she calls them, poisonous cattle, with all the things that they do, like Monsanto and Bayer. But we will talk more about it. She said, "Why should I obey to a law that actually legalizes the crime?" But this is really what is really happening, that now so many things got normalized and very well hidden into the discourses that we don't even question because they are part of the news or they are part of even education, many degrees. The most powerful form of neocolonizing, so-called third world, has been through education. One of the most powerful industries and sectors that UK needed to come up with was creating all sorts of management, I mean, the whole range of management degrees in India and China and everywhere, because that has proven to be really good business economically, but also culturally. You are spreading your ideology around the world about this kind of idea of the progress and modernity, and capitalism is the only form of socio-economic system. You know, it has proven that it is the only one that can sustain relations in the world. So as we what is really interesting, and I think this is very important to highlight, how far the subtlety of that, you know, and I'm not saying that this, I mean, democracy is so important, and I'm not saying that communism or socialism or any other is that's where we need to go back to. It's one of the famous now economist from Oxford University, Kate Raworth, who wrote a book on donut economics, which speaks a lot about regeneration. When she speaks about the new paradigm, she said, everyone is asking me, is this now going back to communism or socialism? She said, really? We have no imagination to think about the new system? That we're going to always fall back to the two major systems that we had in the 20th century? So when I speak about democracy, of course, democracy is so hugely important. And I'm not saying that we have to go to any kind of system where it's going to be but I'm just very critical, because this is what I have been trained, how this democracy can be, how we always have to be so much awake and aware how the discourses and the democracy is, what is serving to us. So that so the good side of democracy is that it gives us the opportunity to really critically to look at it, which was my PhD. So, for example, I learned all this in the capitalist society about how capitalism colonized the world. So it has given me very important critical view. But at the same time, being an academic, it has not given me any economic power to change that, because I can only change that if I really have a huge resources and economic power. So what I can continue to do as an academic is to grow critical consciousness among my students, hoping that one day, or me together with them, we are going to give birth to the new world. But so decolonizing happens when we wake up to this notion that we live in the normalized world, but it is not normal. And it definitely favors and privileges certain positions of power that have been gained, obviously, by the power of 500 years of colonization. The cultural power, I mean, this is very obvious, the American dream and the American culture, the so-called soft power that has colonized our minds, that we can start our decolonization only by reflecting on our own individual consciousness and looking at the collective consciousness. So we all need to work on our individual self, but by using our critical mind, not escaping into what happened to a lot of hippies, for example, as you know, in 70s and 80s. They knew that they didn't like the system, but they didn't have the alternative. And then they all escaped to India and ended up in ashrams and whatever, smoking a joint, and which is not an idea. Idea is that when we start to decolonize our minds, that we actually start to create new systems that are more holistic, that are systemic, that take the perspective of the complex web of life, which our Eurocentric reductionist perspective doesn't have. And by doing so, we start to give birth to the new system and the new paradigm. As the very famous American philosopher and writer and economist, Buckminster, an architect, Buckminster Fuller, said, if you don't like something within the existing system, do not try to fight it. I'd rather create the new one that is going to make the existing system obsolete. And that is what I think we are now doing with this new paradigm of transmodernity and regeneration that I have dedicated the rest of the last 10 years of my life since I left institutional academia, where I was feeling I reached the ceiling of the critical thinking, and then I realized I was just playing the game of satisfying my intellectual ego of being cited, which is, and then especially in social sciences, we reach the ceiling of breakthroughs. And now the time has come to connect the critical thinking with the critical practice.
Amazing. So I'm just connecting the dots because this is our third session of the day. The first session was coming out of India. We're talking about the difficulty of being dharmic, which is living a life that enlivens you, others, and the world. And how it's becoming increasingly difficult to live that life because of all these other, what you call neo-colonial forces. We can call them patriarchal forces. We can call them, we can give it so many names. They're all one complex, right? What the old paradigm was built on. And we were talking about how it's an inside-out job, that we hold all these, the oppressor and the oppressed, the colonizer and the colonized. We hold all of those polarities inside ourselves. We can't step out of them. There's nowhere else to go. All of these polarities and creative tensions are inside us. So the work begins from the inside out, waking up to these creative tensions inside us, the shame on one hand, the rage on the other, the need to heal and also hold pride in the identity as you go. There are all these forces that we need to reconcile inside ourselves. So that was a very important session in the morning about the inner work needed to decolonize, okay? And then the second session, and Vipka, who was leading it, Vipka Hansen, I see she's on the call as well. Her session was called The Land Keeps the Score, right? Just like the body keeps the score of trauma, yes. The land keeps the score. So we've had so much trauma happening to our countries, our lands of origin. Look what's still going on in Israel and Gaza, and there has been so much violence in perpetuating the old paradigm, colonization and neo-colonization, that the land is also holding the trauma and the memory, not just
absolutely. Yes.
That's a mind-opening statement. Like, wow, you mean this thing is not just some rock and inanimate stuff, but it's also animate, and it's also registering its own trauma. And how does that impact the individuals who walk the land? And so yours is the third session of the day, which is kind of building and triangulating the inside work needed by individuals and the need to acknowledge and heal the land itself. Now you're going to take us into a way in which both can get done through the work you are doing, right? Yeah. Which is the work of regeneration as a new ideology and a new practice, which has to start from the inside, but then also heal the outside.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you speak to the idea of regeneration in a bigger context? And then we will come to how you're doing it with tourism.
Yeah, great. Yeah, absolutely. Because that's what I also realized, that when I spend some time in India and work on my inner change and inner transformation, there is a limit to that if it only stays from within. We know that our integral yoga is the yoga of action. So we cannot just stay under the tree, being in our little peaceful world and then not caring what is happening with the rest of the world. And I'm not denying that there is a definitely power in the collective meditation and so on, but we also face very strong material reality of so many injustices that once we find that peace, and it's never a destination because we are work in progress all the time. as you said, this polarization within us gets reflected in the outside world. But being raised as a very critical cultural economic geographer, I learned how important it is, this socioeconomic political work we need to do in terms of education, because that's what helped me. I mean, I came as a naive, innocent girl at the age of 25, moving to New Zealand and not knowing what, just really emotional for the fact that I was in a mixed marriage with a Serb, me as a Croat, our child is a mixed, mixed race, nationality, ethnicity, whatever. You don't know what's going on. And then you come to this way of actually looking at this much more systemically. And then you start to understand the world more. And so this has been kind of my journey that I always wanted to spread this awareness and the level of consciousness to kind of awaken people how important it is what we are doing, that we don't live in our own little bubble. And that has been my mission and my purpose and my dharma in my world, in my life, that I always try to do that through education, through conferences, through formation of certain networks. So when I decided to leave academia in 2012, at that time I moved from New Zealand to Wageningen University in the Netherlands, where for 7 years I was teaching at the top university for sustainability. Back then, I realized that we theorized a lot, but we were not. As I like to say, I didn't really walk the talk, I only talked the walk. And I just woke up one morning thinking, oh my God, but I live in the center of Amsterdam on the asphalt. I forgot the way how my grandma was growing, tomatoes in her garden. I forgot my olive trees, although I was always nostalgic about it. And I said, I learned everything what I need to learn, and now is the time to translate this into practice. And there was the point when first few years I kind of traveled between India and Croatia and doing the work and the project on my island, establishing more and more myself in this kind of area of sustainability as the natural kind of evolution of my critical economic thinking. And it started first with the sustainability, indeed, discourses and practices, as I was teaching within the master's degree of sustainability. But then in the last few years, and I think even earlier than that, and my teaching in marketing, and was always taking this more paradigmatic philosophical perspective, why the whole issue of sustainability is actually not working. We start to talk about sustainability already, officially says 1987 Brundtland report, that's when we kind of established this definition of sustainability, that we don't steal the future of our, the resources of our future generations with our current development and all that. So, but, then we had a Rio de Janeiro in 1992, and then again in 2002, and things were not happening. So I realized we really need to look at why sustainability is not really working, because it tries to produce this universal global solutions, the code of conduct, which doesn't take into account the local complexities. And this is how slowly the whole issue of regeneration started to emerge, because it communicates actually a true discursive, material, and paradigmatic shift. Because sustainability has almost become an oxymoron. It's now considered, okay, we take less energy and less resources from the earth, but it's still a slow way to die. Okay, it's not as degenerative as the pure materialist paradigm, but sustainability still comes from the same way of thinking. As Einstein said, you cannot solve the problem with the same way of thinking you have created them. And this is what sustainability does. So, but lately in the last 7 or 8 years, although the first issues of regeneration started to to be discussed in early 2010, 11, 12. It has taken off in the last few years. And it actually was for the first time introduced properly and more publicly to become sort of more well-known by Dr. Vandana Shiva at this Global Climate Summit in Paris in 2015, where me and my daughter attended back then with the Regeneration International organization, where she spoke about this totally new approach of the new way of thinking and the new way of being and practicing, where we are looking at not sustaining things, but we are regenerating what our degenerative paradigm destroyed. So instead of going with the business as usual, but with alternative sources of energy, no, we have to go intentionally and regenerate our places and our locales and Jenny Fauci and social regeneration and our, social values, because we have been basically almost kind of taken over by this kind of homogeneous global forces, which don't take into account the local complexities, and regeneration exactly starts from that.
I love the frame you've given us. And so understanding regeneration is such an inside out process, and kind of reset and reset back better, kind of, right? In that context, how did you see tourism as a neo-colonial force, and how are you operating in that space now to regenerate tourism? To tourism, regenerate your local area.
Yeah. So tourism has been one of actually really funny to think about that, because it is considered to be a carefree industry where people go on a holiday to recharge their batteries. I mean, the first article I got when I started my PhD, and because tourism was just starting to boom in New Zealand at the time, in mid 1990s, my supervisor gave me this article written by one very strong economic geographer who unfortunately just passed away at that time, who said that tourism and leisure have been one of the most powerful colonial forces of the capitalist accumulation and colonizing our minds, because it is kind of subtly sold to us as our carefree time where we can just enjoy ourselves and enjoy places and spread the peace and the cultures, while actually it continued to reproduce what we call in geography core and periphery issues, where the core was always from the most advanced countries. And back then, when true tourism started to boom in 50s, it was basically 7 countries that were making 90% of the global travel, which was the States, Germany, Netherlands, Japan, Belgium, Italy, I can't remember exactly the 7th one. So 90% of the most advanced economies, because and then they were going to New Zealand or Africa to enjoy the exoticism of this exotic pleasure. It was called the pleasure periphery. So in the countries which were still not modernized, still in a lot of their poverties, but having their sense of place, their sense of culture, the music, the tribal connections and all that, everything what the Westerners lost in the last few hundred years of modernization, where they don't know where their roots because of individualistic capitalistic approach. They don't know, they buy a house in one city and then they get a job and then they move and they don't know where their roots come from. So tourism becomes, as one of very critical sociologists I also studied at the time, who was saying that the leisure class has been the best identified class of modernity, because the European middle class has been traveling to the exotic destinations in order to enjoy the exotic other, everyone else who is not the white European modern person. So but by doing so, tourism touched every corner of the world and started, of course, to change the cultures in these societies which were not touched by modernization ever. And so it was the most Of course, now it's technology, but in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was a very powerful neo-colonial force to spread the Western ideology through pleasure, through all this, because the other cultures that were visited by Western visitors, they only saw these people with lots of money or coming in a nice cars or whatever, and they start to think that this is the kind of lifestyle they would like to have. And this is how the whole, again, the notion of the Western progress and modernity and urbanization and technology and everything kind of spread around the world. And that's why I always looked at tourism as a form of neo-colonialism. So now what I do, I first, with my region and policymakers and practitioners, I'm pointing to them that tourism, if we just follow this Eurocentric market ideology that was created, in the UK by the William Smith and all this kind of, you remember I was talking about this whole notion of the invisible hand that regulates the market, and we talk about the markets of the tourists, and that is such a powerful tool to colonize our mind, not to think that these kind of tourists take away our the sense of belonging, our culture. Like in Croatia now, I see becoming part of the European Union. Our sea coastline has jumped to the roof in terms of property prices. All Europeans are taking over, and we have become almost, before with the colonization, we were peasants. Now we are just rentiers who are renting the boats and the coast and the boats, and we lost our meaning of life. We're just here to serve again the tourists who have money to come and visit our places. We don't produce our own food. 80% of food in Croatia is imported. Our Minister of Tourism keeps counting, whoever it is, every 4 years they change or whatever, and they keep counting the nights, visitor nights, and the numbers of tourists. No one talks about how much money they leave behind. I always say that tourism, this kind of colonizing tourism, is like a train. From one window we take in money, and through the other window we are throwing it out, because when you think about 20 million of tourists coming to Croatia every summer, for 4 months of season, and 80% of that food that you need to feed them, and more than 60% of their cost of tourists is spent on food and drinks, you actually import and give that economic potential to other countries. So my work here is to do two parallel things. I continue to do my political and advocating work and educational work. I work as a consultant to work on the strategies. Currently, I work on one project for the county where I'm creating awareness amongst local population on the importance of the local sources of food and the short supply chains, and how we have to start to rely on our local sources of food, and how our food sovereignty is the key issue, because we could see it in pandemic when all the borders got shut. We all started to scream, "Oh my God, where are our local farmers? Where are our local farmers?" Until then, we were just going to a shopping mall and buying garlic from China, and we didn't care. Not we, but most people. I do care. I never go to supermarket. I virtually go from one farm to the other, as you know, and trying to get my food from the local sources. So regeneration and regenerative tourism is exactly that. My focus is now on food. And I say, a lot of people say regenerative tourism is to regenerate this society. I say there is no regenerative tourism without 80% minimum as sources of local food. We need to create the structures, infrastructure. We cannot blame the restaurants, because I have now explored through this project. It's a really big issue how to be this food to distribute it, the quantity, the continuation and the insurance of the food, because the farmers are dispersed and all this. It's a huge work to be done. But this is where now my work is, and the conferencing on Regenerate Europe, and working with the local farmers and local food producers, that we start to bring our resources together, integrate this this otherwise kind of fragmented and isolated farmers and food producers into a sort of a integrated infrastructure, which can then have the power to supply hotels and tourists and so on. So one day, if tourism falls out, as it happened in pandemic, we have our economic potential of our own local food, which is a huge industry. As we all know, we all have to eat and drink. So I see tourism, only regenerated tourism, as a catalyst through which we can regenerate our soil, our local farming, our food production, to regenerate all the inputs that go into the tourism system, because there is no more multisectoral phenomenon as tourism, because everything goes into, from furniture to souvenirs, to food, to drinks, to architecture, to building material. I mean, it's a truly complex phenomenon. And I argue that all these ingredients into tourism system have to come locally, for at least for the very obvious reason of CO2 and the global climate change. We should stop importing and driving all this food and resources all around the globe. And also then, very importantly, and the most importantly, is what I get really upset about, the whole demonization, as I call it today, of the carbon, that, carbon is part of our earth. We cannot live without carbon. Carbon is part of our body. The problem is that with pesticide and industrial agriculture, we have destroyed the soil, and she has no more power to absorb the carbon from the atmosphere. So if we start to regenerate the soil, and the whole regeneration discourse and regenerative agriculture and regenerative economy, regenerative tourism actually has got the inspiration from regenerate soil science, which has proven that once we regenerate with a different type of regenerative practices like biodynamic agriculture, permaculture, and so on, and compost and animals on the land, we regenerate the soil. She becomes really rich. She's no dust anymore, as it is the case in industrial agriculture, and she can absorb. So you don't need to come up with all sorts of technology that's going to deter the sun to other planets, as some people had the idea, but you just need to regenerate our soil. You start to produce your own food. You help the planet. You help your local community. You create a sense of community. Agriculture is the culture around the food. It's celebration of life. It's so simple, but we don't talk about it. As Roger Beckman, this very famous historian who wrote the hopeful vision of the human history, who said at the conference of the World Economic Forum, I feel like we are all tiptoeing around issues, and like we are at the firefighters conference and no one talks about the water. And that's what is going on at the moment. We need to bring, the soil back into our conversation, because in her there is so much power. So I'm glad that you had the conversation about decolonizing, and healing the soil, because there is so much, and she has a lot of wisdom. She has microbiomes that are important for the health of our guts. When our guts are healthy, our minds are healthy, then we create the healthy systems. I mean, everything is connected, but we don't, our Eurocentric reductionist perspective, everything reduces to very reductionist way of thinking. It doesn't take the systemic web of life perspective, but that is changing, that's for sure.
You've given us such a beautiful context, and I know you've touched on it yourself, but you're doing your work now on two sides, right? On one side, you are being the advocate, you're putting the new story out, creating a new discourse around regeneration. You're doing your part, a very important part with Regenerate Europe. But you're also then doing your own walk the talk, which is you found the land and you've started living on the land in a regenerative way. And you have this grove of olive trees. And so tell us a little bit about that, and make it very local and very personal for our listeners, because I found that so special. I really feel women working with olives, there is something there which can heal the women, heal the land, and then heal the history of that whole region that the olive tree comes from, the Middle East, right? This whole area around the Mediterranean. I mean, I can just see the mythopoetic power of that story, right? So can you speak about that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Um, uh, I mean, I'm so happy that you actually started with the metaphor of olive tree, because that is a strong mythopoetic metaphor of my grandmother. And that's a part of my personal story, which I often tell why I do all this, because I remember my grandma work in the garden and picking the olives and producing her olive oil. So very big part of me returning back to my home country has been this calling, from my grandmother, remembering this sweet tastes of my childhood when we still worked in the harmony with the land. So when I came back back to Croatia in 2012, I had that vision for my own native island, Murter, that I would make Murter as a first self-sustainable island. I had a vision to create a campus for the future. There were a lot of, typically for the younger activist, kind of a very ambitious vision, again in the name of my grandmother. But the community wasn't really ready, and I planted very important seeds, and now they're working on it, and they realized that I was just a little bit too much ahead of my time. And then I decided, okay, it's very difficult to do the change through the civil society on the ground, and I needed to go into my own work on the land. So after actually a few years of trying to also create, and I did a great prototype of a restaurant promoting the idea from the farm to the table, which was actually, I now realize, very early a prototype of regenerative tourism. We just closed it before the pandemic, and at that time I found this beautiful piece of land in an abandoned village in the hinterland from the coast. So I come from a village of island of Murter, which is near Šibenik, for people who Stefan probably knows this area. So it is in the hinterland behind Šibenik, actually in the a region where the civil war was the worst at the time, because it was mostly populated by Serbian population. And when the war started, this is where everything was really very difficult, because these were the people who lived in the region, although Serbian ethnicity. They are Dalmatians, and they lived in the area for hundreds of years. And so, and when the war finished, they all basically were forced to leave, and they moved to Serbia. So to a country that they actually, most of them never lived there, and the area got totally abandoned. So I think there has been something very powerful about the fact that I never visited the village before. I as a coastal person, we would rarely go into the hinterland. It was mostly, at the time I was educated, it's mostly peasants who live there. But because I really wanted to find some fertile valley, and so I come to this area, I see this land, and I see so much potential. So what I interestingly couldn't do on my native island, just 30 kilometers more into the hinterland, I find this piece of land, as you know, you visited, 1 hectare, 10,000 square meters. And I saw one little house in which I could move in. It was just a few months before the pandemic, and 2 old stone houses. And I could see so much potential. There were some olive trees, almond trees, and a big piece of land. And I thought, we have to plant the trees. And then a few months later, pandemic hit. My daughter, who at the time lived in Germany with some of her friends, came to the land, what we call Terra Mira, now Center for Regeneration and Human Potential. They joined me. We did a big crowdfunding campaign through which I got my whole global community engaged. We got some great funds, and we planted around 200 fruit trees. And since then we have tried to do a lot of experiments with what works. I wanted to do agrobiological diversity. I planted some trees that they were not adopted to the soil. So I mean, regeneration is not something you just can learn from the books. You really need to work closely with the land. But the olive trees is the most stable tree of the Mediterranean, as you say. For thousands of years, they thrive so well. And last year, I had a group of Shakti sisters who came to collect the trees, and we produced around 80 liters of olive oil, picked around 500 kilos of olives. So there is a lot of joy and satisfaction by being on the land, working with her. So I don't feel anymore I'm just theorizing. I know how hard it is. I do not romanticize farming. I have my own garden. You really need to be dedicated to that. But what a pleasure when you kind of wake up in the morning and you take your own salad and your own beans from the garden and put it on the plate. And how important it is to work with the land, however small it is. It can be just your little urban garden on the balcony. And another aspect of my work has been that then through that I have been working on the regeneration of the community. This was the village that used to number around 900 people. Now it's hardly 50 and mostly older people. And now, and then I started to restore this one stone house, and some people came from, local people started to slowly come back from Serbia. And now the village started to live more. I created the network with the surrounding area. Now we really there is one entrepreneurial incubator for the local farmers and food production, this project that I'm doing. So it feels, it took me a few years to really get established in the area. I was really feeling a bit lonely at the beginning, especially when all the youth left after the pandemic in 2022 to 2023. But now I feel, by actually landing deeply onto that land and indeed talking about olive tree as the symbol of peace, myself being, Croat, used to be married to a Serb, and now I'm finding myself in a Serbian village and reconciling what used to be a conflict area, and it feels good. I feel so well embraced by the community, and it's just really warms my heart how we are regaining the sense of local community that is not divided by ethnicity or nationality, but actually by the sharing sense of place to which we belong.
That is such a powerful reframe, isn't it? On one hand, the land keeps score of the conflicts that happened, but that same land is capable of being the healing ground around which everyone can transcend limiting identities and find shared ground, okay, shared identity. So this term I'm hearing a lot these days, it's called ecological belonging, right? That people who have lost touch with identity because of globalization and so on, in a way, the invitation is to now begin with the soil, because the soil doesn't separate, right? It's
Exactly.
Mother Earth. It's one ecology we are a part of. And if we can begin by saying, I belong to Terra, I belong to Mother Earth, right? From there, we all belong to the same place, right? We're not from, there's nowhere but this planet for us right now. So this is where I'm from and we are from. And this is therefore our shared belonging, right? So ecological belonging as an unexpected unifying force. If tourism became a neo-colonial or colonizing force, interestingly, the ecological movement that's becoming an imperative at this time can become a unifying force, right? And within that, the Middle East holds a place in unifying the world, because the Middle East holds, and when I say Middle East, I mean the whole area around the Mediterranean, which connects East and the West, right? It's almost as if that land and that sea holds the capacity to bring us back to our essential nature and belonging. And with that, the olive tree seems to be the metaphor for that unification, right? And on our last Shakti tour, we were in Portugal. And of course, when we were in Croatia, we're talking about it's almost like it's a mother archetype, the olive tree, and we can call her Olivia.
Yes.
And somehow she's a presence that she's endured through all the conflicts and separations and everything that's happened in that region. She endures, and she's kind of she never went away. She's still there, and she's inviting us back to a new ground from which we can restart and regenerate, right? By going deeper and wider into this sense of place, which is our ecological belonging, right?
Yes.
That the land and we belong to each other. And from there, everything else now becomes possible. And the olive tree as that mothering principle, that under
Yes.
which we can all stand, right?
Yes. And Jeremy Rifkin, a political scientist that I followed a lot, he wrote a lot of these, great books on the empathetic civilization and collapsing American dream and the third industrial revolution. He's brilliant. And he has a great talk where he describes this evolution of consciousness of the belonging and connecting it also to psychology and all these new discoveries in natural science and neuroscience, and says, what used to be a tribal belonging and identity then moved into the religious identity, and then into the nation state identity, because nation state is actually industrial invention. Before, it did not exist. I mean, it needed for the markets to function. So it's also only a few hundred years old. So then he said, but now as we're becoming global and we are becoming aware of this ecological collapse, we are finally moving into this what he calls biosphere consciousness, that we all finally realize that we all belong to only one land, which is our mother, Pachamama. As Paul Hawken is the key person who writes on regeneration, who wrote a book, Regeneration, Ending a Climate Change in One Generation, in one of his brilliant talks at Bioneers Conference in San Francisco, he said, everyone asked me, is this a communism? Is it a socialism? What is it? It's a Pachamama movement. It's a Mother Earth movement. And a lot of now also natural sciences like James Lovelock with his Gaia thesis shows that she is one single organism that has all these ecosystems that regulate her whole body. So if we disturb one system, then of course we're going to disturb the rest of them, when we look at our system as humans. And when you just think about what was the level of consciousness that back in the 70s, French were testing the nuclear atomic bomb in the French Polynesia, thinking that it's far away from them. Who cares about some of the corals there and the local people? Let's just see so that we can develop nuclear plants in France. That is the way of thinking, And if you would try to do that today, everyone would know about it and would the world would go crazy. So that just shows how our global, and this is where it's again, we go back to the evolution, how we cannot go romantically back into pre-modernity, what happened with the post-modernity and the national fundamentalism movement and all that, trying to romanticize pre-modernity. No, the transmodernity is taking the best of modernity, which is certain developments and technology and now communication, but taking is also into the account all the criticism of that modernity, and then creating the transmodern solutions where we are connecting back to the local, but at the same time being global and ecological and biosphere. So then we have these two forces grounded, and then we get into this kind of a third way. As you remember, also Sri Aurobindo was saying, the West goes with the material perfection, the India goes with the spiritual enlightenment. We need the third way. We need to bring the matter and the spirit together into the integral development of the world.
Just to close on that thought, since you brought in our teachers, Sri Aurobindo and the mother and the integral approach, this thing of creating islands of coherence, how do we go from the old paradigm to the new paradigm? how can we find those imaginal cells of the human caterpillars who can come together and coalesce and create the new human butterfly needed to sustain and regenerate this planet and live in a regenerative way with Gaia. I talk about the need, since you keep saying it's all economics and politics that led to the going astray in the first place. So we need sovereign, local, community economies who are interconnected and in a reciprocal way doing honest trade with each other, right?
Yeah.
So
Greatly put.
yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe
because that's the whole point. When I started my work here on the island, and everyone told me, "Oh, Irena, now you want to go back to the life of your grandmother who did not have electricity and could not read and had to row to the Kornati Island, you know, which is now, you know, she would go for a whole day with my grandfather, while now in 1 hour with the motorboat, you know." And I said, "No, I'm not saying I want to go back, but we need to acknowledge what we are losing. We need to acknowledge that the values of our land and everything what we inherited from our grandparents, take into account our current progress, and then to be intelligent how we take these two into the future for ourselves and our future generations." And we are not intelligent. We are not using the natural intelligence. We are just going like blind consumers into the technology. And the way you saw 2 days ago, there was a cyber attack or whatever, Microsoft Word collapsed for a few hours, the whole world collapses. What is going to happen if this happens at a really serious scale? So if we don't, you know, but of course we hope it's not going to happen, but I need to be localized. And at the same time, I need to be globalized, because I need, Nilima, to feel the sense of the world. I don't want to stay parochial and conservative in my own little village without expanding my vision and my mind and my view of the world, which actually exactly happened to me by moving to New Zealand. Otherwise, if I stayed here, I see my generation and my girlfriends who went to school, you know, high school with me, how they didn't get it because they didn't stay in touch with such an expansion of their view of the world. And this is the beauty of transmodernity, that now what we are moving into, what I really feel in the bones and every cell of my body, that this is what we are now stepping into. As someone said, you know, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet, but it's there. We just don't see it. It's but I think we will live in a very interesting times, and it's not easy because we live indeed in between space, as Charles Eisenstein would say. We live between the old paradigm, the new paradigm. The new paradigm has not established itself yet, but as Bruce Lipton said, with those imaginal cells are now getting integrated and clustered. And once we become so strong, we're just going to give birth to that butterfly. I'm totally sure. But we need to keep our faith, because we're going to get, as we know from Campbell's work and your work, there will be gatekeepers. There will be all these what are villains who try to kind of put us into a self-doubt, and do I need this? Is this working? But if we don't keep that inner connection, and we only stay in activism and outside world, then we lose connection. If we only stay within and we don't go out, so yeah, inner and outer
together.
Together.
And the 51-49 rule, right?
Yes, absolutely.
51% on our intention and awareness on self-regeneration, so that we can have 49% available for context regeneration, right? If we even do it 50-50, it won't work. We must have some differential still available to give of ourselves.
Yes,
right?
Otherwise burnouts happen, and I've seen it too much amongst activists. And there's another beautiful book that inspired me a lot in my work, is written by Paul Ray and Cheryl Anderson, his wife, Cultural Creatives, How 50 Million People Are Changing the World, where they describe the whole, in a very mythopoetic way, the movements of 20th century, the economic, the environmental injustice movement, the social injustice movement, all these kind of rights of Black people, of women, all that. And they said that, and then there was parallel to that, the human development movement and the spiritual movement, and they didn't come together. They were living in two separate worlds. While now in the 21st century, we realized that, activists were burning themselves out because they did not have an inner connection. The spiritualists, they stayed kind of blissed under the tree, but then realized that they are not grounded enough and not material enough, and then become almost like a useless hippies very often. And how in the 21st century we need to connect the two, the inner world, but also taking care of our outer world, and of course our body as the interface is very important to be regenerated. So that's another beauty of the term regeneration, that we regenerate ourselves with healthy food, healthy practices, healthy exercise, healthy relationships, that we really consciously walk through our lives in the way how we make ourselves feel, and other people how we make them feel, and how we then go through our lives more consciously, because then we're gonna at the end of the day have a more conscious world, because as the mother says, the state of the world is the state of our collective consciousness. That's what it is.
Yeah. And we should not be shy to use the word spiritual intelligence in addition to emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That is to be included as well in our growth.
Yes.
Yeah. So wonderful, Irena. I am so delighted. Just yesterday, I was in Querétaro, where the Global Wellbeing Summit was being held. It's a group of people like the ones you described, all activists trying to change the world, make it better. They realize they burn out, so they first also need to take care of themselves. So this whole summit was called the Wellbeing Summit, the Hearth Summit. And these were all themes that were discussed there. So one of my roles at this time, I'm full-time faculty of excellence with Tec de Monterrey in Mexico. I'm a professor of gender and conscious leadership. And you can't teach conscious leadership and even ending patriarchy and so on without discussing regeneration and growth of consciousness. And, so it's all connected. And
yes.
We have to be well and stay well if we have to be the change we wish to see in the world. So your work is so important. It bridges and reconciles so many paradigms and dimensions needed to sustain ourselves and regenerate our planet. So thank you so much, Irena. And we still have, Alex and Stefan on the call. Does anyone have a question for Irena in closing? We can open the room for questions.
Thank you.
Or comments.
Sorry,
I'm open.
I don't have a camera. I just came back from the run, so I'm sweaty and red and all this stuff. But I just wanted to say thank you. It was very insightful talk, and yeah, my only question in this sense is, will there be a recording of that? Because I would watch again.
Yes.
Thank you.
This is being recorded. There will also be a summary. We have an AI assistant. These are all the good things with technology. So it does a great summary. So yes, just follow us on social media. We also have a YouTube channel for Truth and Reconciliation. Our website is truthandreconciliation.net. So just follow it and all these will be posted.
And I just have a question for you, Stefan. You said you followed my work. How, when, what is the connection?
Okay, thank you. So you asked me a question, but then I will ask the question after that. Yeah. So, well, I'm doing a PhD. I'm in the last year of my PhD. I work on transformative paradigms, different of them, and the majority of my work is dedicated to regenerative tourism and regenerative development. And I mean, I followed your articles, your publications the last few years. The one from 2020 inspired me a lot. Your observation on the need for transformation, but some works before as well. So that's how. And then I simply followed your work, and when I write, I cite you as well. So that's how I follow you. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to participate in the event in May. I was informed well before about that, but I was in the middle of the field work. I finished field work with one community that is living completely regeneratively in other part of Europe. So I mean, I will happily discuss it with you if you manage to
Yeah, I would
find
love to.
time. Because I want to have, you know, like to collect information and do work in the field with them, and
Right.
hopefully something nice will come out from that visit and time with them. And yeah, I was yeah, first of all, thank you for really deep and profound thoughts, and you know, you're expressing not only, you know, the past, but as well, you know, your own transformation. It's really nice to hear how you see it. But I was thinking about something else, you know, how you see this, I would say, you know, modern form of colonialism, how we have this so powerful extractive economies of, you know, like extracting metals and the minerals from, as you said, third world countries for for seeking, you know, like sustainability of Western societies, you know, which is completely unsustainable. So, you know, risking whole societies and communities in countries in Africa, in Latin America, soon to happen in the Balkans as well, for the, you know, creation of any product that needs lithium or any other mineral. So, you know, we speak about the colonization, and then we are living in a moment of, you know, different way of colonization.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I was saying, that sustainability is also disguised, in some ways disguised form of neo-colonization,
Yeah.
because it addresses it into a kind of a caring discourses of sustainability and alternative technologies, but still comes, that's what I was saying, from the same mindset, from the same greed,
Yeah.
the same ideology. And that's why I always get very irritated when someone tells me that something is sustainable because they have alternative sources of energy. That's not, you know, we need to change the whole, as you know, if you work with the transformative paradigm, I wrote a lot about that. We need to change our ontology, our ways of being, the way how we are in the world, how we relate to the nature, how we reconsider our habits, what we eat, what we buy, how we buy, what we consume, and all these things. And so not alternative technologies will resolve that. We need, you know.
Yeah,
So
for that, I sometimes use, you know, this beautiful graph by Bill Reed, where he positions like green, you know, on practically the lowest point, then in the middle is sustainability, and everything above is, you know, forward towards regeneration. So, you know, I think there's this huge gap how so many people see sustainability or regeneration even through this perspective of, you know, electric car or green development, or, you know, it's,
yeah,
I think the communication there is as well a huge problem. And
of course, and there is always a co-opting the term, or as I like to say, hijacking. You know, you have a pure ideas like regeneration. Now, Dr. Vandana Shiva is saying we have to reclaim back the original term of regeneration. Now everyone talks about regenerate. There is now, we talked about greenwashing. Now we have a regen washing. You know, now regenerative economics, regenerative leadership. What does it mean? You know, mainstream market economy, as soon as they see this as a marketing opportunity, oh, now everyone talks about regeneration, let's, you know, without actually really questioning the foundations of it. And that's a really, that is a main challenge, that's for sure. But in my work, I can say, I know it's very, it can to be considered very naive thinking when you think about the global powers and big tech and the money they have, and the, you know, you could almost go depressed with this whole dystopian future of the world. But then whenever my students ask me, so how do you see that your positive paradigm of regeneration is going to happen? I said, I don't know, but I'm just thinking how Galilei was feeling in his classroom when he had to defy that the earth is not flat and ended up in a house prison. I mean, you know, at that time you ended up in the dungeons, you know, if you would say something against the church. So just think about that. You know, you just don't know how the history can shift. And maybe the nature will do this for us. Maybe the nature will say, you know, I had enough. And if you humans don't see that you are part of me, then, you know, so I'm sure something is going to happen huge that is finally going to challenge this kind of system that thinks that it can continue extracting our resources in the business as usual. Yeah. So Stefan, I wish you good luck with your PhD. Now I know where it comes from, and I get still quite a few PhD students who tell me that they read my work. I kind of stopped writing academic stuff. That was my last article in 2020, and after that, you know, it's going to be either a more popular book, but writing academic articles, I don't have a reason to do it. No time. You have to do the real.
No, I completely understand you. I still work with practitioners, so I know how rewarding is that work and how more satisfied one is when, you know, the results are directly there in practice and something concretely is done. So I understand your movement, and I wish you all the best with your project as well.
Yeah.
Hopefully I will have the opportunity to visit it.
Yeah, and come to our conference next year. We're going to do it again in Croatia, in the national park, around similar time. Now the national park Krka was so happy with the second conference. We are now really evolving, so it would be great to have you there.
Great, thank you.
I also feel there's time for, I hope someone comes up with the idea of on similar discourse on decolonizing education and academia.
Oh, yes. I think that is something I would love to, you know, to write about, because a lot of my colleagues whom I sometimes now meet at some conferences, and they all ask me, so tell us, you have to write a book, Life After Academia, you know? So as some of them, you, Nilima, you entered in a different way, and you are Faculty of Excellence, and, you know, you come from the practitioner's point of view, but the traditional academic path is all about the theory and the ladder of that many publications from your PhD. You know, it's very, very, dry and reductionist in many ways. But at the same time, I'm grateful I did it. I was in the belly of the beast, and now I can speak from that space.
Yeah, you've done your heroic journey so beautifully. So with that, Irena, thank you so much. It's been a complete joy and privilege. I have known you for many years. We've had many such conversations, but I'm just so delighted that today we managed to put it all together in this one session. And it's really like the summary of your thesis, your worldview, your work in the world, and, you know, who you are. And I'm just so glad we did this, and thank you for making the time. I know how busy you are, and so thank you for making the time for this.
You're very welcome, and thank you for your invitation and this opportunity to actually, indeed, with your very intelligent, great questions and, you know, leading me to actually summarize it so well. I really feel inspired by that. So I'm looking forward to get the summary also.
Yes, that may well become the next book. Let's see.
Yes, indeed.
So, all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Stefan.
Day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.